Yes. Oh, we're
If
live.
we are indeed. Okay, so good morning, and to everybody who have just joined us. Thank you very much for being with us on this Wednesday morning and for being with our special guest today, Tom Frengos. If you have seen the title, we're going to talk about a very beautiful, actually, Japanese concept today. That is the concept of ma. And we're going to talk about this because Tom wrote a book about ma. The book is called 15 Poses, ma, 15 Poses. And we're going to hear what he has to tell us about pausing in life, how important it is, and why we all need to do it. But before that, I wanted to say that you have probably met Tom on LinkedIn already. He's a writer, a teacher, a coach, and explorer, and he's based in Fukuoka. He has been in Japan for quite a while now, but we're going to hear his story from himself. Tom, welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Maya and Tim, for inviting me. And thank you for the title. I love the title. I don't know who came up with that title. I think it's just brilliant. I struggle with writing titles for my podcast. Um, yeah, I've watched your podcast a few times. I'm quite excited to be working with you. I guess maybe I'll just say hi to anyone in Japan or around the world who is listening in on this. Welcome, and thank you for coming.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And yes, Tim, thank you for doing that because some noise, background noise appeared.
Oh,
And
I
yes,
couldn't hear you guys. The rain is so loud here. It's really coming down. So it's
okay.
okay. This is better now. Is this better?
A little
yes,
bit. Yeah, I can hear you.
a little bit better.
Okay. I don't have a mic,
Yes,
so I can't get rid of that sound. My
right.
apologies.
Okay, so yes, and Tom, could you please tell us a little bit about how you came to Japan? Well, when you came to Japan, and
Oh, mm.
yes, why are you in Fukuoka as well? If you don't mind, of course.
Yeah. I came. I was living before coming to Fukuoka, Japan. I was living in Australia for 15 years, and I was teaching. I was coaching. I was studying coaching at one coaching degree in Sydney, and my wife and I lived there. And I think around 2017. We made the decision to move to Fukuoka, Japan, because that's where my wife is from. Is from. That's where she was born. And yeah, so I came here with a lot of optimism, but also a lot of empty space because I left Australia and I had really no contacts here. So I'm starting from zero, like from in terms of relationships other than my wife's family. And so I thought, well, what can I do during this time while I get myself settled? So obviously, I learned the language as best as I can, not very as best as I can, and I started writing. I was writing a chapter for. This is where I started engaging in writing more a chapter on on identity, cultural identity, and one of the themes was about using wabi sabi as a way to resolve our cultural identities. Because and I wrote about my Greek, Canadian, Macedonian heritage. As a child, it was quite interesting, challenging, and and so I decided to write more about that. And I attended some conferences. I even went to Mount Fuji. I worked on Mount Fuji in 2018, which was quite fun. 5 weeks, and then took 3 weeks off to do conferences, and then came back, and that got me a bit more connected with Japanese nature, uh, silence, that sense of humility when you're on a mountain and you can't control the weather. And then that got me thinking about a presentation that I wanted to do about Ma in Sydney, in Tokyo, I mean, and it was about Ma, using Ma to help us resolve our intercultural identities. People who have two or three cultures that some people are struggling to manage. And yeah, so when I so after I wrote did the presentation, I thought actually this is a very interesting concept. I would love to write a book on Ma. It sounds very interesting, and I think. But one of the challenges about writing about Ma is there was a lot of information on it, such as how it's expressed in Japanese arts, music, theater, work. But there wasn't like a challenging book that was on how we could adapt, how we could adapt to it, how we actually can integrate into our lives. And I believe that probably one of the greatest gifts that any culture can give you when you adapt to it is the different value set that you willingly and freely embrace into your identity. And that's sort of what I wanted Ma to do, is to how Ma can make me a better person, more patient, a better listener. Back then I was the worst listener, and I was a teacher even. And so how it can become better. So that's sort of was my journey up until this point.
No, that's interesting what you said to me. One thing that resonated now is that you said, different a different value set and different values that you willingly accept. Because what I have noticed throughout my 2 decades here in Japan is that many foreigners come to Japan with a lot of expectations, very high expectations actually of the country, and they unknowingly project their own values on the Japanese friends and colleagues. Yes, and yes, right. And
Sorry,
by
this
doing,
Tim. He's muted or something. Tim, can we hear you? No, I can't hear you, Tim.
your mic is mute. Yeah.
I don't know how that happened. I didn't intentionally mute it, but that's okay. Yeah. No, I was going to say that was me too. The first 4 years I was here, that's my big story of how I had an epiphany because I was projecting my values, right? So that's all. Go ahead, Maya. Didn't mean to.
Yeah, but I wanted to say that there is so much resistance to accepting the values that this culture here has, right? And offers to everybody who comes as well from a different part of the world. And there is a lot of resilience, there is a lot of resistance, actually resistance, because people just do not want to accept the fact that they are projecting. First of all, many of them, they don't know that they're projecting, but the next thing is that there is that fear within us that we do not want to lose ourselves by just saying, oh yeah, you are right, right? So, and that resonated with me, that basically you want people to willingly accept the values that are offered by the Japanese culture.
Yeah. Tom, I was going to say it resonated for me because you made this statement about wabi sabi and using that to integrate. And for me, I came here for 10 years and I became too Japanese. I went back to the States for 30 years and I had to recalibrate.
Yeah.
And but I didn't resist the values. I just was completely ignorant when I first showed up. But there were certain things that resonated with me right away. The idea of being humble, but letting your action do the talking.
Yeah.
A talented guitar player telling me, "Oh man, I'm still learning the blues, but I'm doing my best. I'm trying to get better." And then I hear him play, and he's a pro.
Yeah.
He didn't tell me how great he was. He showed me, and I thought, "Oh man, that's so cool." And I better stop bragging. I better have a little more humility, So I mean, those were but for me, it took a trip back to the motherland to start reintegrating because I went too far, almost where I wasn't being authentic. I was just clueless. I picked up all these traits, right? And it took me a long time living in different places to figure out who I am and readjust. So I did it the hard way, I guess. But now I'm in a good place, right? But I never thought of using wabi and sabi to integrate. So hopefully you got an example for us because I think that's really interesting.
Oh, thank you. Actually, when you talk about this, it reminds me of actually, I wrote a book on culture. It's no longer on Amazon. It was called Cultural Chameleons and Tall Poppies. And what I talked about is the different stages and how we adapt. And one of the things with Ma is that we learn about Ma, we understand it, but we may not adapt to it because it's too different to us. for me, I was living the anti-Ma life. I was always in a hurry. I was the worst listener in the history of mankind or humankind. And but what happens is that we eventually have to try it. And what probably, if any things about adapting to culture, you have to make it attractive. That it has to appeal to something that you like. In other words, you plug in. If you're interested in art, you listen to music, then I encourage people to find an aspect of Ma that resonates with their love of music. And that's what I did. So I started off with the easy things that I like, because I like music. I like no theater. And I realized that actually Ma is sort of like, it relates to how we detach to culture. And enough once we go to the slides, I'll explain what Ma is that and how Ma represents two opposing forces, our way of doing things and our culture of doing things. And unless there's something in the middle to bind us, to unite us, it'd be very difficult to do it. And probably the most important thing is, when adapting to Ma, I had to do it authentically. It had to be real.
Right.
Realizing that I'll never be the greatest listener. I wave in from time to time and realize this is who I am. Everybody has their own personal brand, their own way of integrating Ma, and which I'll talk about shortly.
Yeah. I never thought actually of the term being a good listener in depth. And you said that, well, some people just cannot help but jump into the conversation. And actually, it never hit me as something that is not good, because basically when you jump into a conversation on the way, you show attentiveness, and you show also that you're listening to what the other person says actively, so that your thoughts go and you process the information and you're ready to react to it or comment on it. So it's also another aha moment at just now for me.
That actually, I'm glad you mentioned it, because I do have a slide on that talks about do we sit and listen or do we jump in? And there are cultures who overlap, who tend to jump in, and they view it as a good thing. But if you don't mind, I will talk about it. I do have some slides on it. It's based on a research study that was done in 1985, and I just find it quite amusing, because I think Ma is good, but sometimes anti-Ma actually helps.
Right. Shall I bring the slides on the screen, or would you?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so let's see if I can move these. Okay, so I think probably best before we move on is to have people understand a little bit what Ma is. Ma is based on a Chinese character, which means a pause, a silence, a gap. But the interesting thing, it actually can be read a lot of other ways. It can represent kan, and if you put the word kukan, it means empty space. And if you put the human character next to it, can mean ningen, meaning people coexisting in the space. So Ma is just a very dynamic concept, and all of those concepts I've just mentioned apply to my book. But it's based on two components. One is the mon, or the gate, and what you can think of these two gates as two human beings facing each other, different ideals facing each other, the beginning and end of a journey. So one gate represents the start of a journey, one represents the end of the journey, or one represents the start of silence, the other is the end of silence. And what's in the middle represents the he, which represents the sun or the day. And so what happens is that I love this photo. This photo I took when I was working on Mount Fuji. I was taking these morning climbs up the mountain, and this was shining through a torii gate, which is very important to the concept of Ma. Essentially, Ma is the sunlight, the healing, the restoration, the discovery between the gates that happens. So that's why we have that he character. And a lot of times when we have silence, we think there's nothing in that silence. We should break that silence. Or when in a journey where we think there's nothing to be gained by going further. So what happens in the beginning of our journey, we don't see that he, we don't see that gate. We see nothingness, we see a void. So what Ma represents to me is also a patience and a faith that something is emerging, that in this silence between you and I, an understanding is developed. New ideas are being developed. Okay. So essentially, Ma is a journey. Every day when we're commuting from our home to our workplace by train or by bus, that represents Ma. And that in between space is our train journey. And some people find those journeys quite annoying, quite boring. But there was a research study that was done in the UK, I think just during COVID, about commuting. And a lot of people can find that light in between that, a chance to read, to learn a language on the train, to catch up on their podcast that some people are doing right now. And probably most of all is Ma is becoming, where in this pause, in this journey, we're becoming more patient. We're becoming a different person. If you're adapting, we're becoming more intercultural by embedding. So you can see this as our journey to adapting as well. And the only way that we can actually become that way is to find some kind of commonality, some kind of beauty in it, a shared connection between us and the other person. So essentially, like we were talking about, Ma is that Ma can represent our intercultural conflict between sharing our, having our own way of doing things and then doing the other way, and then finding some kind of halfway point, a middle way where we could adapt, where we can be ourselves. Anyways, I'll stop there right now before we move on.
Okay. I found Ma to be, for me personally, a reflection time to reflect. And I may have mentioned this when we originally talked offline, but so I used to interpret a lot of the presentations that vendors would come to our startup company. This was in the US, but it was Japanese owned. And usually at the beginning, the Japanese managers were the audience, and I was just doing my best to interpret. And the American salesman would give his presentation, and he's all excited and positive. And then at the end, he'd give his quote, and then there'd be like dead silence, right? And they were thinking about it. They were thinking about that. They didn't want to just jump in and respond right away. But what we found out was that the presenter would get nervous by the silence, start filling it up, and actually start dropping the price in one case. But he was, in essence, he was negotiating against himself. And the Japanese on our team started seeing that, wow, this might be a negotiating advantage. We just won't say anything and see if they drop their price. So that was one of my, and I had, when I sat on the other side of the table on an American team, I had to train the Americans when it's silence, don't say anything, just out Japanese them, just outwait them. And, let the silence, it was so hard for them to do it though. It was really hard, even though they knew. So just a comment on that. Yeah.
No, actually, it's very valid because actually in my book, I do write about that. And I remember getting that idea from an English workbook when I was teaching in Korea. And but one thing it is, yes, silence is reflection. It can also mean to think things over. And actually, there's a phrase my wife taught me. It's not very common. It's called mokusatsu, which means to kill an idea with silence. Sometimes people will use it for many reasons, but there are many reasons behind silence. It's reflection, as you say. It's for negotiation. It's for intimidate. I don't know if any of you read manga, but there's a phrase that they sometimes use when there's silence. It's called shin. Shin.
Yeah.
And it's meant to mean silence, but later on, I do talk about that because there has been some research that has been done by psychotherapists on the different types of silences that actually have been validated. Reflection obviously is one of them.
Yeah. And when I was younger, I'm the Walkman generation when that came out. And I probably was one of the first people to get a Walkman, right? Because I was here. And I was listening to music all the time. Now I'm older. There's a lot of times I don't want to listen to anything. I just want the silence. Like Maybe it has to do with age, or maybe it's because I'm a curmudgeon, but I've come to value the time when it's really quiet. So,
I do that as well. When I come home at night, I don't listen to music. I just have it silent. When I'm in a car, before I leave, I get out of the car, I sit in the car in silence. And there was a study that I cite in my book that when they have music and then they actually have a pause, that pause actually lowers your blood pressure, lowers your heart rate. It settles you. So I think it's a very valuable thing to have that silence instead of music.
comics also use the pause,
Yes.
even in the US, right? Um, so I think that's interesting too. Just another art form,
Mm.
because the pause is everything. That you know, it gives you more impact when you, whatever, make the next statement, or you give people time to just sit on this for a couple seconds, and then I'm going to finish the joke. So,
Yeah, actually, that's a very good point. I think what you're, correct me if I'm wrong. So you're saying that pause is sort of preparing us for something that's about to happen.
like a
Something.
punchline, or
Yes.
yeah, or you
Yeah.
let people think about it without saying it, and they know what the punchline's coming, but then it's still funny when it comes. I mean, there's a lot of ways that's used, but I that's the art form I like the most. I love stand-up comedy. So
Yeah,
I
I wonder also whether there is some, generational thing there, because I also remember my mom, she loved reading books, and she would tell me every time she had a book, and she would say, "Well, I have reached the point before, the end, and so I'm just giving myself an hour or two before I go into and see
huh.
what happens at the end," and she would do that with every book she read. And I wonder whether this, of course, it's just one anecdote and one person, but do you think there is, something there that the older generations were better posed or better prepared to pause and give it a thought?
There's no
I
social media.
yeah, well, yeah, exactly. I think I don't know if there's any studies done on it, but I think the fact that we do have social media, it does make it difficult for us to pause. There's more pressure to get things done. Well, AI is a perfect example. Is that we're using AI to get things done right away rather than take that time, that reflection time to try to figure things out. I think AI is great for a lot of things, but I think it's sped the world up, and it's very hard for us to pause more because we're under so much pressure to get things done. Yeah, I don't
And we're
know.
addicted to distraction now. The algorithms got us on these dopamine highs, and when you have a moment, rather than just sitting there in silence, it's just so easy to pull your phone out and be entertained. Yeah.
Yeah, because like I walk by I'm doing some training for the Nakasendo Trail in October, and I'm doing some training up a mountain, and so often I'm very tempted while I'm walking down that forest to grab my phone, but I've just learned don't do it, don't do it. That phone will be there, any messages will be there, and it's a very hard, it's a very hard thing for us to resist.
Yeah, it is indeed. I find myself pulling my iPhone and checking how many steps I walked, probably every 100 or 200 meters. It's really funny. And inevitably, I check the messages as well at that point of time. So even though, yeah, the messages will be there, and I have become to know the routes I walk so well that I don't have to check the, the phone
Anymore.
actually.
You
Yeah,
already know.
more.
Yeah.
I already know, but I
Yeah.
still do it.
Um,
Yeah, and I will say I'm not addicted to my phone, but it's not because of self-discipline, but because I have my old boomer eyes, and it's hard to read small screens.
mm,
So, and I don't download too many extra apps. Like I don't have any social media on my phone, like including LinkedIn, because when I go out, that's my ma time. That's
yes.
my. I am addicted to my computer though. That's the thing. Not my iPhone, my computer, because I have a bigger screen. but I can get away from my computer. I can't, it's hard to get away from your phone.
Mm.
So I rarely look at my phone, except like I check the time or to check if my wife sent a message on what time we're going to meet somewhere. But that's
Mm.
it. You know? And I get mad at people who are looking at their phone while they're walking. To
Oh,
me,
yeah.
unless you're doing GPS, I understand that because you're trying to follow a road. But if I have to look at my phone, I stop, I go to the side, get out of the way and do it. It's safer, and I think it's more courteous. I see so many people walking into the street and the lights already
I
turned,
know.
yeah. So I think Yamato outlawed walking and looking at your phone.
I think
Yamato
they
City.
should. I think they should also outlaw people from reading their phones while they're actually on the bike. I've noticed some people on the bike. I'm
Mhm.
like, oh my gosh, is cycling that boring that you need to use?
Yeah.
Well, basically, what Ma is that learning to think of any type of distractions or things you want to talk about. You want to text someone and going back to it. Ma is actually separating from that, which you do, and that is an in-between space. It's a liminal space, we call it, which we'll talk about. Only when we do that we can become truly present. And later I'll talk about the tea ceremony. How the tea ceremony was one of those places during the warring state periods to forget about what was happening in the rest of the world. Um, so maybe what I'll do is I'll just go to
Right.
talk a little bit about what Ma is, and I think if for people to learn to embrace Ma, it's about learning where we can find Ma in Japanese culture. And somebody has told me that my book almost represents like a different version of a guide to Japan, a more spiritual guide to Japan. I wasn't thinking about that when I wrote it, but it's nice to know that it has some different applications to it. But probably the one person who introduced Ma to the world was an architect named Arata Isozaki. I hope I pronounced his name right. He recently died about 2 years ago, which is sad. He introduced Ma to the world. He was working until his 90s, and he said basically Ma is in not just in architecture, life, art, music, every moment, every kind of behavior. And we've got it in No Theater. Have any of you seen No Theater before?
Yes, yes, I have
I
a
haven't
couple of
seen
times.
it live, but I've seen clips of it. Yeah.
Yeah,
I,
it's
I,
yeah.
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I remember when my wife and I went to it. She was saying, "My goodness, there's so much Ma." And
Yeah.
now some of the Ma is the silence where they will
Yeah.
stop. And now that stop is meant to emphasize what has happened before and what's to happen later on. And in that pause, there's that connection that is supposed to be built between the audience and the actor, where the actor is creating a tension of holding that pose, that to maintain that silence, to show that restraint, the beauty in restraint. And in that, we're creating this connection with the audience, where the audience is also feeling that restraint, that connection. And they can almost read what is behind the pause. For example, I remember watching this pause take place in the theater, and I was noticing, that pause is representing ambivalence of what to do next. And so it establishes a connection to it. Now, Maya, you said you've seen it before. Have you noticed that Ma in the performance?
Yes, I never thought of it as ma, actually. So I thought, oh, it's so slow, and almost,
Mm.
yes. So I haven't seen it recently, but when I went to Shibuya, to the Cerulean Tower. They have a no theater there, and it's really, really a beautiful place. So I have been there a couple of times, and every time I went, I just couldn't wait for the end to come, because I thought I need to know what happens at the end. I cannot wait for this long. So I was definitely somebody who did not appreciate or couldn't appreciate the map at that time. Maybe now I will be a little bit better equipped to do that, but not back then.
Well, I think it would definitely help me once I start writing about to understand it. I won't spoil too much, but when you go to a moth theater, it's always good to go well before it starts, so you can see the empty stage. And that
Mhm.
empty stage is a very important part of Ma, about that sense of emptiness. But probably one thing I do like is called I drew this a long time ago. It took a long time to design this. Is where the no actor is crossing from the dressing room or the green room, where they put on their mask and mentally prepare themselves to transform into a ghost that enters the hashigakure, which is read to be the bridge between the bridge of the dead to the bridge of the living, which is on the stage. And one thing that will happen is the no theater will walk very slowly in what you mentioned, very slow, a very slow journey from that part to the stage. Sometimes they will stop, potentially to show effect. And what they're essentially telling us is that any journeys are not to be rushed. They're to be done in their own natural pace.
Yeah.
That it's, yeah. So that's what they emphasize in that. Have you noted? Do you remember seeing that in the stage? Because that's
I do, yes, I do remember that, seeing that on the stage, as you mentioned, when the actor was coming. I was not lucky, to know that what actually how can I say, the connotation of that was, right? So even though I went with a colleague of mine who is Japanese and she loves no, she didn't explain to me what each part, of the no performance was. So it was left to me to interpret the way I found fit, and I wasn't prepared. I couldn't interpret it the way it should have been. So yeah, I thought after a couple of performances, I thought that I would just not do it for a while.
But the aesthetic spectacle
yes.
for some people makes it worth it, even
Oh,
though
absolutely. Yes.
the pace is boring, but you're looking at this beauty on display.
Yes, and basically, yes, it's so beautiful. The stage is wonderful. The whole hall there is beautiful. Everything is wonderful. The one thing I thought about at that time was that they basically they cannot teach no, the masters, right? They cannot teach no by writing. So when you teach no, you have to be there in person. You have to have the teacher, and you have to have the disciple there, right? The learning actor. And I thought, wow, that's fascinating, because thinking of it, you can never actually describe in written what the angle of the knee should
Yeah.
be, and if you don't have somebody to show you and to see how you're doing and to correct your posture and so on, you cannot teach no there. And that was fascinating to me at that time. So I remember looking at the actors, walking in this and that, and thought, wow, how long does it take for somebody to teach the right, the right speed, the right angle, the right posture, everything. So it probably takes decades, not just years.
It does. And what it is that because of the mask that they are wearing, they don't have very good eyesight. They have a limited field of vision, so they're relying a lot on their memorized movements, their kinesthetic awareness. And there are some good, interesting articles. I think I did cite about is the spatial awareness that they teach you. And one thing is they also say is that a lot of them will not rehearse much before performance. They go in with an open mind for anything to happen. They go in with a sense of spontaneity. And even I'll admit, even before going into this, I was trying to prepare for this. What do I say? What do I say? And I realized, okay, I know enough. I think I know enough. I'll just go in there, do some preparation, but not over prepare. And the one thing is to also trust your movements, trust your kinesthetic awareness. I only wish I knew all this stuff before going. And at the same time, not knowing can also be quite beautiful. This is where your imagination has no context and you can create anything. And I'll talk about is that sometimes the best starting point is not knowing, or that sense of nothingness.
Yeah. Well, I've heard, I know what you mean by kinesthetic awareness, but I've never once in my life ever used that term. So thank you. Now I'm going to look for chances to use that. You described it well. So.
Well, thank you. And it's interesting you mentioned about you wish you had had someone explain to you about that Ma and no theater. I remember having this experience in 2018. I was going to the Wabi Sabi conference, which I was presenting at. And one of the great treats is that we got to see a kabuki performance. And I remember the actor suddenly stopping a pose, rolling their eyes, making some kind of dramatic pose and pausing. And this is called a mie. And what someone's screaming out, I think he was saying narataya, which means their family or whatever. And I'm saying, who the heck is screaming? Why are they screaming? Someone called him Sacho, which means president. Why are they calling him Sacho? Why? And but then someone told me, fortunately, someone did tell me that it's meant to show encouragement, to heighten the actual engagement with the audience, to show respect and to encourage them. And one thing I would remember, someone told me, is that that's called a kakegoe, the shout. And that person from the back of the room, called the umuko, he or she has to call at the right time, jump in at the right moment. So you've got to do it before that person ends the pause, or not before they start the pause. So its timing is very key. And if you don't have that timing, then you're KY or kuki yominai. You're not reading the air, and obviously that's a very bad phrase. But what this thing has a lot of bearings on how we interrupt in a conversation as well. When having that timing, when someone pauses, when someone is silent, learning to jump in right then before they speak. So that has a lot to do with our conversations as well. When do we jump in? When do we not? When do we overlap? When do we wait for that person to stop? When do we allow a few seconds of silence to resonate?
Yeah. The first time I heard mie, I was listening to a rakugo story. And the story, it's of course silly rakugo stuff, but it was about people in hell are having an economic depression because there was this new device created by the humans called a kechimyaku, and it forgave everybody when they died, no matter what their sins were. So everybody's going to heaven, right? And so the context was hell is getting together, and it's it's structured like the Japanese government. And the Sori Daishin says, we need a good thief to go to the land of the living and steal the kechimyaku. Who's the best thief? And they said Ishikawa Goemon, who was famously boiled to death. He was a thief in the Edo period. And there's a kabuki, it was very kabuki-esque, right? And they said right before he's requested to go to the land of the living, and right before he is sent to the living, I think they called it Shaba, they said, Mie o kite, and then he transformed and went to the land of the living. And that was like, I had no idea what that meant, but it was basically in that context, strike a dramatic pose at the right time. Does that make sense in that context?
It does.
We got some comments, by the way, so I was just...
Oh, yes. Okay. Did you want to raise?
Do you want to handle that later, Maya?
Yes, we can do that later.
Okay, very good.
One thing is, I think about 3 years ago, my wife introduced me to calligraphy, shodo, and for me, that's where I really discovered what Ma is from a kinesthetic sense, from the way we control our hand movements.
Yes.
And for me, I'm a very fast person. I was working in a restaurant when I was younger. Everything was fast. I was working in the advertising industry. So everything was about getting things done. But calligraphy is about that sense of slowness, the slow movement of the brushstroke. And I remember when I was doing the character Ma, I was doing the character very quickly. She was telling me, slow down. And there was a point where you actually stop, to slow down, to emphasize, to be in that moment. And then also prepare yourself for some other motions like the hane, which is like a jump. It's got this little pointed results to it, or the harai, which is like a sweeping motion. But I was always remembering trying to get it done fast and not enjoying the slow process, because in that in-between space is the process of creating the art and not worrying too much about what that art is going to look like at the end. So I would say that Ma is a very good, is a good place. So calligraphy is is a very good place to learn about Ma, to appreciate Ma, but also how to gauge is what your body is doing, because Ma is also being aware of what your body is doing. When I'm tense, I tend to rush it really quickly. When I'm relaxed, I tend to go very slowly. So Ma is also a space to be aware of what our body is doing.
In the moment.
In the moment, exactly.
Yeah.
And one thing I'll talk about that in the moment is what can also happen when we are in the moment. It's really hard to be 100% in the moment, because what can happen is that when people are doing calligraphy, it'll suddenly remind them of their childhood. The smell will remind them of their childhood. So while we want to be in the moment, it's not always possible to be in the moment.
Easy to say. Yeah.
Exactly.
I think when you're in the moment, you don't realize it because you're so in the moment.
Yes, no, I agree. You've heard the concept of mushing?
Yeah.
Mushing is like being in the flow, where you're not thinking about what you're doing, and that is in a way a sense of Ma, but it's also a part of wabi sabi, which I am actually talking about in my next book. But if you don't mind, getting back to the beauty of the white space, is that I've been told there's a phrase called yohaku no bi, which means the beauty of the white space. And in Japan, in calligraphy, the white space can be just as important as the ink. What the ink represents is our dialogue, our tasks, the things we're doing. The white space represents our free time, the silence, and why we need to pay attention to that, and why we need to pay attention to it. But not just the space, the white space around, but the space between, is giving each character its own space. And this also represents people, giving people their own space to be themselves, to speak, and not try to dominate the space. So and there's also a sense of making sure that each one of these characters have equal size, and like each person in our dialogue and our conversations has an equal voice, has equal opportunity to speak. And that's what I get. I came out with that realization when I was actually in a calligraphy class, and I think the white space is such a valuable part in our life, about why we need more of this white space.
Yeah. And I wish, because I think traditional Japanese art, that's very applicable. I just wish their modern advertising would take those lessons a little bit better, because I think it's cluttered. Their websites, their advertisements. It's almost like, what is it, mujun shiteru. It's a contradiction almost.
I agree, because I remember people were saying the Japanese have a very minimalist lifestyle, but if you look at their websites, it's anything but. And I
Busy.
think
Yeah,
it's very busy. And I think what that stems from is, my wife mentioned to me, is that we want to inform the people as much as possible. We want to give them information. If you don't give them enough information, then we feel that we haven't done our job. So there is the contradiction. That could be one of the reasons why. That's the dilemma. Why sometimes we don't have that minimalization. That's why we tell ourselves, I want a minimalist life, but I can't because I need to do this. So there's the dilemma that we manage when we're trying to strive towards Ma.
Yeah, I need all this extra information. So it's a very information driven, and it's very similar to Japanese business presentations and schedules. Americans, this is in Japan, working for the Japanese, struggled to look at their presentations because we call them cluttered. And ours were more like 3 to 4 bullets per slide. And so I asked a lot of Japanese, I go, how do you explain it? They said, we Japanese want to know context. We want to see in one glance how everything fits together. And when we look at American presentations, they look pretty, but we don't get, it looks linear to us. We don't always get a feel for how things are connected and how they relate to each other when they're presented in a linear way. Anyway, for what it's worth, some Japanese folks explained it that way to me, which makes sense.
Well, I think your concept of context is also explained as why it's so difficult to read kanji, because the Ma character can change based on what is before it and what is around it. And and also learning whether we read the Chinese reading or we read the Japanese reading. And
Right.
so context, it's everywhere. It's in their writing. It's in their work. It's in their presentations.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just move on here. Please feel free to stop me by if there's anything you want to add. Now, this is a really beautiful approach to a shrine in Fujiyoshida Sengen Shrine in Mount Fuji. I remember walking there the day before I was going to work on Fuji. And what Ma is, it's an approach. So think of this as you pass through the Torii Gate, that's going through that first gate. And the shrine represents the end gate. But a lot of these walks will be long. So you can stop and be mindful of nature. And it's also meant to show that connection with nature. And Kengo Kuma says that nature is a very important, that the shrines are very important. It connects us to nature. And if you can see there at the end, you can't fully see the shrine. It's partially covered. And that also represents our journeys, is that as much as we like to think our journeys, we know what our journey, the end of our journey is going to look like, we don't know. Some of it may be completely covered, and then you will actually understand what that end point is the closer you move into that.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And then we talked about, Tim, you mentioned about that escape from social media. So, the tea ceremony was also meant to be that escape from the world. During the Warring States period, Sendo Rikyu, who was the tea master at that time, he wanted that to be an escape for samurais to come and meet each other as equals, to escape the war and not to talk about politics. The tea ceremony represents that liminal space where we're forgetting about the work we left behind, the problems we left behind. That moment will come, but not yet. This is where this is meant to be an escape, an liminal space, or what the Japanese call a tsukima, a crack in our busy life where we can jump into and inhabit as long as we can. Have any of you been to a tea ceremony?
I have not.
It's just very poetic. There's a number of rituals that we do to go inside to the tea ceremony. There will be a sukibai basin, which is like a water basin where you're meant to wash your hands to cleanse yourself of unwanted thoughts. And that's actually why a lot of shrines have that little water basin where people can actually wash their hands. There's also a machiai shitsu, which I finally got this right, pronounced it right this time, where it's a waiting room where you're surrounded by nature. You're meant to shut yourself off from the rest of the world. And then there's a rojibata, which is like a pathway that's stones that are not actually meant to be in a structured sequential way. They're random, and that's actually meant to show the random of life. And that's actually meant to bring you deeper into this new world. And then there's a place called the Nijiriguchi, which is like a crawl space where people crawl through. And that's meant a sense of humility where you are immersing yourself into something greater than yourself. And that's what Ma is meant to be, where there's that sense of humility, which you mentioned, Tim, that sense of escape, where you are in a new world, and that is where you truly can become mindful when you are silent and you're not thinking about what I'm going to do when I get out of this place. And for a lot of us, it's very hard to do.
Yeah. For folks, just FYI, for folks like me who'd never heard the word liminality before, I looked it up. It's a state of transition, a period of ambiguity and disorientation that exists in the middle of a change or transformation. That's the AI overview, for what it's worth.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's what Ma represents, that in-between space is the liminality, the transition from work, from home to work, from our old identity to our new identity. I'll even mention the pandemic was Ma. It was a sense of liminality, an in-between space. Actually, I had written quite a few things in that book about Ma. I decided to get rid of it. No one wanted to talk about it, but we were in Ma back then.
Yeah, and to the point about the stepping stones. So in college, I took a class on Japanese art. It was a history of Japanese art, right? And I can't remember which Zen garden it was, but the professor was talking about how it was structured. And he said, "Do you see those stepping stones? Yeah, they look random, but they have a purpose. And the purpose is to draw your eyes downward.
Mm.
And then when you get to the end of the stepping stone and you look up, you see a new scene. Like they want to prepare you to that scene by drawing your eyes away. And then when you get to the end, boom, you look up and you see that the next scene. So that kind of is a Ma period to set you up for the next view. Does that make sense as well?
It does, actually. It does prepare you for the next view, but also because it's actually random, you have to pay attention to it. So by paying attention, you become present. And then when you become present, you prepare yourself for the next event.
Yeah. Okay.
If any of you do martial arts, karate, kendo, there's a concept called ma'ai, which is meeting in the ma. And a lot has to do with the space, reading the space between us, and reading the energy, reading the air between us. Because when we go into a space, we are giving off an energy. And Ma is actually about paying attention to that. Is the Ma good? They have a saying called Magai, meaning the Ma is good, or Magawarui means the Ma is bad. So Ma is space is a very important part of it, but also to pay attention to not just the empty space, but what happens when people enter the space.
Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Sumo. Any of you notice about sumo is just before when they crouch down. Now there's a tachi-ai, which is where they're crouching down, getting ready to actually jump at each other. There is that 1 second or even less than 1 second pause. That is also a ma. But in that ma, it actually creates an excitement where we're sort of waiting for something to happen. Yeah, so that is ma. And this also brings me to a little bit of architecture, which was a very important part of my writing for this book. But we also talk about the void, and Kengo Kuma was probably one of the biggest influences on my book for Ma, and then him and Arata Isazaki and Dr. Yoko Kawai from Yale University.
I think I'm connected to her.
Yoko Kawai, her work is beautiful. Her work, and actually, I will mention her now that you mentioned her, is that she specializes a lot on space and well-being, and she talks about creating these spaces that hides the destination to make you more present. But she also mentioned in one of her presentations on space and on well-being and mindfulness is that space has the power to improve our well-being, and that we tend to forget that. And she talks about Ma, she talks about Michiyuki, which I mentioned in my book. She talks about the concept of Yugen, and her stuff is brilliant and pioneer. I was so inspired by her work, and also by Kengo Kuma, which I love this. And when you look out into an empty sea, this is a void. This is Ma. Is that where he says the void is a sensor, in that he said the void and the human being or the human body are working together to feel something. So when you're in a space, your body is trying to make sense of what is happening in the space. Is there a change of light? Is there a change of smell? And this is why a lot of Japanese architecture, especially Kengo Kuma and Tadao Ando, talk about the shadows. Shadows represents a movement in the space. That space is not static. It's not independent. Space and time are connected to each other. Space will change as time progresses.
Just a quick comment. It just occurred to me listening to you. I was thinking, I always believe that just the law of economics, whatever is in small quantity has more value.
Yes.
And in Japan, where space is at a premium, like there's not a lot of space, even between people, especially if you live in Tokyo, it makes sense that you would value having space when you can get it.
Yes.
Because it's in small supply.
Actually, my wife actually mentioned that to me. She said that one of the reasons why we like space so much, because there's not much of it. Because
exactly.
70% of Japan is covered by mountains and forests.
Yep.
No, I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that. Have any of you been to Asakusa Culture Tourist Information? It's right across from Asakusa Temple, the Kaminorimon, which is the Thunder Gate.
Yeah, I've walked by it. I don't know if I've ever been in it. It's been a while though. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, I highly recommend it. And there's a really nice, I think on the top floor where you can get a nice view of Tokyo. You can see the Sumi River. Can I pronounce it?
Sumigawa, yes,
Yeah.
Sumigawa.
Yes, Sumido River, and there's a nice curry shop where you get some nice curry, which I enjoyed. But what I really like about that place is if you look at this very carefully, what Kengo Kuma designed is that the way he creates these little wood blocks, they're not flat, they're protruding, and what they are meant to do is to create some shadows. Now these shadows actually change as the light changes throughout the day. And what he says is that shadows represent a spirit, and when and those shadows move to show the progresses of time within the space. And he mentioned that when there is no shadow, there is no spirit, and how important shadows play in Ma.
Makes sense. Yeah, I like it.
Probably one thing, maybe because we're short of time, and I know this is something that Maya wanted to talk about. She talked about is the silence, the conversation overlaps. Now this presentation this research got me really curious about Japanese culture, but why there were so many silent periods. Now this was done in a very small sample, but it was done over a long period of time where they were having Japanese, American, and Brazilian negotiators negotiating. And what they measured was a number of things. One on touching, which not really related to this right now, but silent periods. And that you'll notice that the Japanese had the highest amount of silent periods that were greater than 10 seconds for every 30 minutes. The Brazilians actually had 0. I remember showing this to my students, and they were laughing, especially the ones who had worked with Brazil. I think there is a cultural component. It could be also based on the context of negotiation, but also there was also the conversational overlap, which is also Ma or lack of Ma, according to people, is where people would jump in. Now, as you can see, the Japanese and the Americans were significantly lower than the Brazilians. And with the Brazilians, and actually I've also encountered with the Indian culture is what Craig Storti mentioned, is that jumping in those conversational overlaps is not meant to be rude. It is meant to show that you're understanding, that you're supporting, that you're completing the sentence. So this is where there's a dilemma between, do I show this Ma, do I not jump in, or do I jump in to support? And some people will, and this is where you need to read the air, does this person like me to jump in? So this is a bit of a blend, is when do I show Ma, when do I not show Ma? Does that help, Maya? Because I know you mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Well, it's very interesting to me because I do think that basically it's mostly based in culture and how people communicate. Communication has a lot of differences. And depending where you are, whether you're in Asia, whether you're in Europe, or whether you're in the United States. But also, I think that another thought that jumped on me while listening to you was that in Japan, Japanese people keep quiet at their workplace. And I think that, of course, they show respect to others, the others' effort when they do that. They don't want to impose their thoughts on their colleagues and so on. But at the same time, I think that with the Japanese, it's also the way for them to preserve their personal space.
Yes.
And that is the mental space, I mean. It's not the physical space so much, it's the mental space they want for themselves. So keeping silent is also, I see it as a way for the Japanese to preserve that Ma in their heads, in their minds, and to be themselves there.
Yeah, and creating boundaries, personal boundaries. Yes, and I also often do that at times where I'm with people. Sometimes when I want privacy, I won't talk, and I'll just escape into my own little world. Yeah, Tim.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, the second graph surprises me a little bit. Conversational overlaps. Japan is more than America, and it just doesn't match my anecdotal experience. You know, I rarely do I hear Japanese talking over each other. Certainly at meetings, right? But
Yeah.
so I thought that was an interesting stat.
Yeah. Remember, it's a very small sample, and there could be a number of reasons why. Could be the context of negotiation being stressed, not under the English. Um, I think for the Americans, we're probably 10.3, a little bit because it's based on some values that it's rude to interrupt. I think probably, and I would probably agree with your experience because I've encountered it a lot lower where the Japanese would very rarely interrupt you. But to keep in mind, it's culture, it's context, but can also be the person. When you're stressed, we interrupt people. So stress, if you're calm, you're more likely to show ma. If you're stressed, you're more likely to show anti-ma.
Right.
Yeah, if you don't mind me just making a point here, because I can see that this study was done over a long period of time, but the results were published in 1985. And this is right in the middle of the bubble economy, when the spirits were very high at the workplace, right? We cannot just take out something out of context. And I think that context here probably will explain what Tim noticed, because there was a lot of confidence back then, right? There was a lot of also expectation and everything. So I would say that probably the context also has something to do with this, counterintuitive result, because 1985 was a very different time from what it is now.
That's the year I graduated from college. Yeah.
It's interesting you're saying, because and I agree with that. What can also happen is, I remember showing my students this, suddenly right away they were automatically stereotyping. And this is what Ma is that pausing to get the facts, to understand the context before you make a conclusion. And I agree with that. I tell people it's just an old study. It's current in some ways, but we need to go down the deeper level, like the deeper exploration before. And this is what Ma is that slowing down to learn, to understand, get the facts before you make a conclusion. And a lot of times we're in such a hurry to make these conclusions. So Ma is slowing down before you get to that end gate.
Yeah. And I also think that with the Japanese, there's a little bit of the individual in the moment doesn't want to say something that doesn't represent the group he or she is with. And the Japanese did a lot of caucusing to gain consensus on how they were going to respond to certain things. So I always thought there was this reluctance to just speak out. So that may have something to do with it as well.
Actually, that brings me to one of the things about why some people will stay silent. It's done. There's a number of pauses done by Heidi Levitt, which talks about it did it in psychotherapy. And one of the types of brands of silence is obstructive silence, is where we will avoid someone. To avoid discussion, we want some silence, some personal space. But also, what you were saying is think very carefully about what I'm going to say next, because I've got my manager in front of me. I've got my supervisor. I don't want to make a big scene. So learning how to read the silence, and that's what I talk about. I won't explore too much after this because I don't want to spoil anything. But if we can learn to read the silent air, we're less likely to see Ma as something that's bad. Some people will pause because they want to connect with emotion. They want to reflect. Some people pause because they want to move to the next topic. Anyways.
Yeah, and I think one great way to learn to read the air, because we all have to learn, is sometimes it's better to be quiet, and then later approach a trusted Japanese coworker and say, what was I missing, or what did that mean? Or, like ask them to teach you. And by this dialogue, I've learned over the years, I've gotten better at learning to read the air. So
I was once called by someone in Mount Fuji that I was working with that I was KY. And I go, I know what KY means. I was the anti-KY. Anyways, yeah. So, Maya, is there anything you want to talk about? Any comments people were making, or questions that you wanted to bring up before we wrap up?
Well, some people, we've got Hiroaki, who is a regular listener, and he commented that Ma is the spare or free time. And he also, while we were talking about samurai, he wrote, keep meditating in Ma until the time comes. So these are comments, about his, I believe, his understanding of Ma.
Actually, what he's right, and I write about it, is that spare free time could be a tsukima, a crack where Japanese love that tsukima, where they can break away even for 5 minutes before a meeting to catch their breath, to meditate. And also, there's a Japanese term called senohima, which is used in Ma, which means like free time to pause. I hope I've answered Rocky's question there, or comments.
Right. No, their comments. And yeah, thank you very much for. We have come to the time when we usually say goodbye to our listeners and wish them a happy Wednesday. So, Tom, thank you so very much, really, for this being with us and for talking about mind, how important it is, how much we need it actually in our life. And to everybody who watched and will watch from now on, Tom's book, 15 Poses, is on Amazon. And you can have it either in Kindle format, digital format, or you can order the paperback, which is a beautiful book. We've got the paperback. It's really wonderful. It feels very nice to have it in your hands and actually
Very
turn
well
the pages.
written.
Yes.
I've only read like 15 pages, but it's just very engaging style. So I recommend the book to everybody.
Yes, and if you haven't connected with Tom yet, please do reach out and connect with him on LinkedIn. You can also go through his posts there as well, or just send him a message. So that's all for the moment, and thank you very much again, Tom. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Hearing
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks a lot for that. Okay, see you next time.